There's a really interesting relationship between oxytocin and cortisol, the primary stress hormone. And you see this invert graph effectively, whereby if oxytocin rises, cortisol reduces. And that is very simply, if you imagine your early months in life, your brain experiences little momentary rises in oxytocin when you're in your first few months of life, when you have a moment of fear as to who's taking care of me and am I going to survive, when you're a human that can't survive for yourself. Cortisol would effectively rise and our body would then experience some kind of emotional distress and a baby would begin to cry and make sound. When that baby is crying and making sound, it naturally guides the parent back towards them. And because you can't just communicate to the baby because they don't understand your words yet, the only way to settle the cortisol system within them is through physical touch and love. And our brain immediately knows from the beginning of life that if I'm in a stressful experience, oxytocin is going to be the thing that brings me back into a feeling of safety.
TJ Power, I want to talk neurotransmitters here for a minute. And when people think neurotransmitters, they immediately think the big two that are commonly known, dopamine and serotonin. But I think there's a lot more that drives our day-to-day, drives maybe our motivation, how we feel, possibly even how we look. I want to talk about one in particular. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Oxytocin. It's a unbelievably important chemical for our brain. It drives the connection that we can experience as a human. And we have moved to a world right now where we are very dopamine driven as a species. We're very much in the pursuit of pleasure rather than in the pursuit of contribution and connection. Understanding this chemical and learning how to optimize it is life-changing.
So what is sort of the known history of oxytocin? When I say known history, I mean as far back as we can go, what is it for? When would it, come to be?
It's very interesting. This whole framework we've built around these different chemicals is built upon this concept called evolutionary mismatch. It's a brilliant idea by the scientist called Gluckman, which basically suggests our brain evolved for 300,000 years, developing these different neurochemicals in order to help us survive and thrive. And each one serves a specific purpose for our ancestors that drove us to survive and get to this point now. When you look at oxytocin, we had to wake up every day, not with the pursuit of just helping ourselves personally survive, but we had to be deeply focused on helping the group around us to survive. Humans alone in nature do not thrive. We will die very fast on our own in nature. As a group, obviously, we have flourished. We've got to this point we're at today. And the deep driving neurochemical within us that made us want to contribute to the group, that made us want to sit there, scratch rocks together and create fire to keep us warm in difficulty, the chemical that drove that desire was oxytocin.
After today's video, I put a link down below for Thrive Market. That is a 30% off discount link plus a free gift. So 30% off your entire grocery order. The thing I like about Thrive Market is they're trying to help get gnarly processed foods out of people's fridge and out of people's pantries. So these are healthier for you options, better for you options, and the prices are highly, highly competitive. So a lot of times you're gonna find prices cheaper than the grocery store and it's delivered directly to your doorstep. So when it comes to recalibrating your pantry, Thrive Market really, really is solid. It's very helpful to be able to have all your grocery shopping at your fingertips so you're not stressed about finding the right things. You can search. You can do a quick search for gluten-free. You can do a search for paleo. You can do a search for sugar-free, for keto, for this, for that, all at your fingertips, and then it's delivered directly to your doorstep. But let's be real, we're all pinching some pennies. So the best thing about it is that 30% off discount link off your entire grocery order using that link down below. I use my Thrive box consistently. I'm always changing up stuff. I'm always getting a Thrive order coming in a couple times per month, and it helps save me a bunch of money, but it also gets me some really cool stuff that I otherwise wouldn't find at the grocery store. So check them out in the top line of the description underneath this video.
Interesting. So you think even as far as our drive to want to succeed and create a better life for ourselves, I mean, it's almost as though that was driven in a way, we think it's driven by dopamine because that's our drive, that's our get up and go and our motivation. But it's the true pull to really make a better life for your family, make a better life for your village, make a better is probably driven by love and compassion and this sort of more oxytocin-like effect.
Definitely. I mean, love is the most powerful emotion we can really experience. Whilst we can experience a big high off maybe success in our career, something financial, for example, would be like a big dopaminergic experience. There is nothing more powerful than the love that someone may experience with their child or their partner or whatever it may be. Oxytocin is the top neurotransmitter in terms of what a human can feel. And when you think about it with motivation, dopamine is incredibly important for creating drive within us. But if you are only motivated to help yourself, your motivation is going to be fleeting, effectively. Like if you think about it in your career, in the pursuit of exercise and nutrition and all these aspects, if you are only ever helping these people with the mindset of this is helping me in my personal life, then it's not going to drive you as much as if you really put yourself in the mindset of how is my work serving our world and serving these people. And if you think down the lane of oxytocin drives us to have that group contribution mentality, which is actually more motivating for our mind than just selfish pursuit.
That's interesting because you hear people talk about it casually. People will say, you want to have purpose. You want to have purpose. And you even look at, various areas of the world that have the largest concentration of centenarians that live for, and the common denominator is purpose. But that's sort of this, verbal diarrhea for a lot of people where it's just like, okay, you got to have mission and you got to have purpose. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means like really this like strong draw to like have success, not just for yourself, but for others. And it feels as though dopamine is almost putting you in a spot where it's something you're just going to fill up and drain, but not really have that purpose. Mm-hmm. What actually happens in the brain when there's a flood of oxytocin?
It's going to effectively create much more of a feeling of fulfillment. And it's just incredibly important to understand our brain had to be wired for group contribution, not selfish act. And whenever say for example, you took that ancestors type idea, if they successfully caught an animal and then instead of bringing it back, they ate before and they ate on their own and didn't give the food and share the food, that's going to be terrible for the survival of that group. And it's going to create this selfish feeling within them that's going to create guilt and shame around that action. And dopamine, a lot of the actions that impact it are associated with a feeling of guilt that I'm not necessarily contributing outwardly, but I'm only pleasuring myself. If you look at the information, there's a brilliant scientist called Algo who's gone deep into this world of connection with humanity and contribution and the relationship that has with oxytocin. You just see this flood of oxytocin as soon as you're in service. And purpose is a very complicated topic. Like it is hard to figure out what your purpose may be, but I think it's very important if you were considering what is my purpose, it should really lie within what is my greatest skill set that can contribute to another human being. And inside that is where oxytocin is going to rise within the mind.
Are there ways that you can gamify like a surge in oxytocin? I mean, I know there's little short-term contributions, right? Like, I mean, oxytocin is sort of known as this, like, it's jokingly called like the cuddle hormone, things like that, right? Where it's like you get a hug, you get that embrace that can surge oxytocin. But rather than hugging yourself or just going out and hugging a stranger, I mean, what are some ways that maybe people can improve oxytocin levels short term and then possibly long term?
There's an interesting aspect of how you connect with another human being and the conscious aspect of how engaged am I in this experience of connecting with another human being. We've done a lot of research. I run a neuroscience lab called the Dose Lab where we study these different chemicals. We've had 50,000 people come through this and we get them measured across lots of different things. The physical connection one is a factor. Hugging does have a big impact on oxytocin. We've basically seen humans need around 5 hugs a day for a good stimulation of it. Of all the people we've ever asked the question of how many hugs do you average per day, we're at 1.4 hugs a day. So humans aren't having enough of that. Hugging is a factor. When you go into how humans connect with one another, there are some key ideas. There's this concept called active listening. And when you are in a conversation with someone, it can be incredibly easy to effectively spend your time whilst they're talking, formulating the response that you're going to say to them in your mind, but not actually listening to what they're saying. And it's very clear when you look into oxytocin that when someone's attention is extremely present on another human being and their eyes are focused and they're listening well, oxytocin is significantly rising more within you both. We're now in a world where it's very easy to either be just distracted and formulating responses or be getting like our phone out in social situations whereby we're completely separating the oxytocin. So I'd say step one is in social settings, being extremely present and extremely engaged, listening extremely well is very valuable to the chemical.
What about, does it have any impact on perhaps performance or like training and fitness in general? I mean, do you think that if you're in a spot where you are driven, I guess I could come to some conclusion that maybe if you are feeling like you are getting fit or stronger for a purpose that's good for your family, right? Like perhaps I look at like this kind of to protect your family, right? If you're really driven by, okay, this is not just for me, this is not just for vanity to have a six pack and look a certain way, but I really want to be strong so I can protect my family. I mean, is that an example of how you could kind of harness this to really perform better?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're looking down that lane of how is my action serving others, it's always going to bring in the oxytocin to the conversation. The other aspect is how you're communicating with yourself and your mind is heavily connected to oxytocin. And whilst this chemical has been kind of perceived as like the hugging hormone where you connect with other humans, and that's accurate, but it's not the entire story. Whenever you are having a good moment of connection with yourself and having a good celebration of something in your mind of some progress you've made, you're seeing a rise in this oxytocin chemical. You actually see in research, we had a big part of this in the book, whereby individuals with more oxytocin in their brain will communicate with themselves in a more positive way. When you look at performance and someone's performance, it's extremely easy to be incredibly critical of how you're performing in your life. And if you took an example of someone wanted to eat healthier, for example, and you had two individuals and they were both eating great Monday to Friday, they both had a really good whole foods diet, and on the Saturday they ate a pizza and an ice cream. They both ate the exact same thing. If you looked at the communication in their head, one of them might go down the path of, this is awful that I've done this, I'm so bad at dieting, I'm fat, and so on, a very critical route. And the other one might go, that is really frustrating that I've kind of screwed up my path here. However, I've just successfully achieved 5 days of healthy eating. If you look at the ultimate performance outcome of those two conversations in their mind, one of them has reinforced negative eating and one of them has reinforced positive eating based on how they've communicated with themselves in their mind. And if you have more frequent reflections of positive progress, you're creating more oxytocin and driving yourself to a higher level of performance on your given pursuit.
That is wild. Yeah, what about this is a dense one that could go a lot of different directions, but the idea of sort of forgiveness and self-forgiveness and dealing with, people don't realize how much shame people carry for themselves, right? And when that stuff is kind of released, how the ability to, not at the risk of sounding kind of cheesy, almost love yourself and have more like true passion and love for who you are as a person, seems to rise, right? Mm-hmm. Is there sort of a tie-in there neurochemically, like when someone kind of like lets go of their past a little bit more and allows them to truly like excel?
I think there is an aspect of that. I think we can carry shame and guilt around our actions and stuff like that, and it can negatively affect the conversation that's taking place in our mind. But I also do think our brain is a very clever mechanism whereby it is trying to send us key messages around things. Like if you took a completely other lane of thinking around something like watching pornography, people carry some shame and guilt around, maybe I shouldn't be over consuming this. The reason you're carrying that shame and guilt is because your brain and body is a very clever mechanism trying to guide you away from the action. So with some shame and guilt, like I think there's a conversation to be had of, is there a message here that if I listen to it, it will then enhance my life if I take action and alter the behavior? I think if there's shame and guilt around things that may be based upon like your childhood or your parenting or something you learned, that maybe when you talk to yourself about it, you think, oh no, that's actually just shame. That's not actually something that would enhance my life if I stepped away from, then it might be that you need to not listen to the behavior. So it'd be based on whether it's enhancing to your life or not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think about it from, if you look at special forces operators, you look at the military, and you look at sort of what drives them to perform in a very stressful scenario. Mm-hmm. Right? And when you talk to them, like by and large, they feel like they have they're able to almost put themselves aside for a little bit. And they're almost purely driven by the brotherhood and the team aspect, and also just getting back home to their families or serving their country. And that's what I'm thinking about as you're talking about this. It's like it's almost a compartmentalization away from the self for a moment, where it's less dopaminergic. And when they go into a combat scenario where it would almost be bizarre to think that it's an oxytocin-driven thing, because that's framed as such a love and soft thing. But I would imagine that there's scenarios where it would make you rise to the occasion even better, because you've got this drive that is much stronger than the drive to just suit yourself.
Definitely. And oxytocin definitely is not just like a love soft thing. Love could drive us into like the highest level of performance possible, because if you think about a situation whereby your family were in danger or something like that versus strangers in danger, you're feeling a greater level of oxytocin. So you're going to actually have a greater level of capacity to try and save your family over strangers. And oxytocin is the difference there. And if you're in the situation like that military-based example, oxytocin is going to drive their connection with one another. And we are just a species that fundamentally grew up over ancestors' years, 300,000 years, with oxytocin as the driving chemical. We woke up every day not thinking, how am I going to feed myself? It was, how is this group going to survive? And every single action we took to build the shelter and make the fire and find the food and forage for the fruit, whatever it may be, was driven by the group. And if you think about how society has shifted over the last few hundred years, we have become more selfishly focused of how is my life being enhanced by my actions. Even in this moment right now, this is an important conversation to me. These podcasts are really cool opportunities to connect with people. If I sat here in my mind thinking, how is this podcast serving me? How will it impact my business or the Dose Lab or followers or whatever it may be? It's going to put my mind into dopamine. It's going to make me selfishly focused. Whereas if I sit in this conversation and think, how is this conversation going to serve others? How are the people that are listening going to have an advanced or enhanced experience of life as a result of listening? It's going to get me out of my own way and allow me to just communicate in the best way possible. And dopamine and oxytocin are then really impacting our performance. And if you live in a mindset of oxytocin is my primary focus, how is my action serving other people rather than how my action serving myself, you are going to perform at a higher level.
So will oxytocin increase both ways? So if I were to compliment you or give you true like words of affirmation that were really sincere, would it trigger an increase in both of us?
Yeah, and this is where oxytocin is so unique, because when you look at these other chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, we personally have to take action and engage in a certain behavior in order to create an increase in it in our brain. Oxytocin is the only chemical where you could successfully increase someone else's oxytocin without them doing anything. Like, I can't just make your dopamine go up. You would have to do something challenging to make your dopamine go up. But yeah, with that great example there of some kind of affirmation or kindness or love, that would then create an oxytocin rise within your brain. And we as a society right now, many of us feel lonely and many of us feel a lack of love. And it's our group responsibility to start creating rises in oxytocin in one another through the way in which we communicate and act.
What actually happens? Like, does the brain itself change? Have you seen this kind of in your groups where maybe even under fMRI scan or anything like that, does a physical brain change when oxytocin levels are higher? Like, is there actual change in the different regions of the brain? Is there more neuroplasticity?
It's largely that you're just creating an increase in the amount of oxytocin circulating between the synapses. So where you're not looking at like structural changes in areas like the prefrontal cortex or the hypothalamus, it's that there's more oxytocin being circulated among the synapses. You want to imagine that the oxytocin molecule, it's like a little vesicle. You could imagine it as like a little bubble effectively in the brain. And you have synapses where communication is taking place. More of those bubbles are effectively transferring across those synapses, which is creating the emotion of love and desire for contribution within our world. And as it rises more and more, your capacity and your desire to pursue that path grows.
When we get ourselves into maybe a stressful situation, do we tend to become more dopamine driven to get ourselves out of that fight or flight? Or is that highly, independent depending on the person and kind of what their conditioning is?
We now have become a society that utilizes the quick dopamine in order to try and alleviate the stress we're experiencing. So say, for example, you have something really stressful happening with your relationship or work or finance, whatever it might be. It's very easy to utilize quick dopamine like social media or sugar, for example, to try and make our mind incredibly immersed in that activity to then make us not think about the thing that was stressing us out. It's really important to understand that when we are experiencing stress, the emotion is coming up for a reason, and it wants to be heard. It wants that message to be spoken to you in order to try and guide you in some way. When you're looking at dopamine distraction, it's not serving you. It's just prolonging the difficulty that you're going to experience. When you look at oxytocin and stress, there's a really interesting relationship between oxytocin and cortisol, the primary stress hormone. And you see this invert graph effectively, whereby if oxytocin rises, cortisol reduces. And that is very simply if you imagine your early months in life, your brain experiences little momentary rises in oxytocin when you're in your first few months of life, when you have a moment of fear as to who's taking care of me and am I going to survive, when you're a human that can't survive for yourself. Cortisol would effectively rise and our body would then experience some kind of emotional distress and a baby would begin to cry and make sound. When that baby is crying and making sound, it naturally guides the parent back towards them. And because you can't just like communicate to the baby because they don't understand your words yet, the only way to settle the cortisol system within them is through physical touch and love. And our brain immediately knows from the beginning of life that if I'm in a stressful experience, oxytocin is going to be the thing that brings me back into a feeling of safety. And it makes sense because, again, we couldn't survive on our own out in the wild. You put a human against like a tiger, obviously we have no chance. You put a group of humans, we have a good chance. And we are so deeply driven that in stressful environments, we need other humans. We need connection and love. And often when we're stressed, we're now isolating ourselves and going towards quick dopamine, when really we need humanity and we need connection with the people around us.
Perhaps half-life isn't the right word in this scenario, but does dopamine sort of act shorter in the brain than, say, oxytocin? Because, I mean, everything that I'm hearing almost sounds like we're getting quick hits when it comes to dopamine, checking our phone, or, it's almost always filling a void. And anyone that's self-aware, I think almost all people recognize that, even if it's an addiction, right? It becomes a phone addiction or a sugar addiction. Most people are aware that they're doing it to fill, or a coping mechanism of some kind, to get that little hit in dopamine that just makes them feel good for a moment. From what you've seen, is a hit of oxytocin going to potentially last longer than a hit of dopamine?
The big thing is in the phraseology there, in the sense you wouldn't be able to get a quick hit of oxytocin effectively. Like, it's always going to be something that slowly rises within the brain and body. Even if, for example, if you hug someone, you really quickly hug them and let go, you don't feel a moment of connection. But if you hug someone and you embrace them and you hold the hug, you experience that feeling of connection. When we have dopamine is the only chemical that society has successfully learned to hack effectively. Like, dopamine was also something designed to slowly increase in our brain. All of these chemicals are designed to slowly increase in our brain. Dopamine, we invented all of these things like sugar, social media, porn, cigarettes, whatever it may be, that hacked it, that spike it, and that crash it out. Oxytocin is going to last within our brain for a longer period of time. If you were to take a scenario like sex is very oxytocin related, human connection in an intimate way. If you were to have sex with someone that you had no emotional connection with, and it was just like a very quick experience, you got to get a little bit of oxytocin because there's like bodies touching and you're having sexual intimacy, but that wouldn't last very long. But if you had sex with someone that you feel deeply in love with, or even at the extreme end, if you were successfully trying to create a baby or something like that, there's going to be this massive lasting experience of oxytocin. So it is a chemical that, if in comparison to dopamine, is going to last much longer within our brain if it's created in the right way.
That's, as a family grows, maybe like, more kids coming into a family, like, have you seen that just circulating oxytocin is higher in a family environment, like where there's just essentially more love in the house, even if it doesn't feel like day over day, when you're, let me rephrase that, when you're in the thick of it with kids, right? Like, it's hard to stop and smell the roses, but you know that it's there. Like, you know that you're working for your family, you love your family, you love that, but maybe you're not physically stopping. Maybe you should, but in the cases of many families, there's a lot of embrace there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of that fundamental safety, but maybe they're not stopping and giving loving, embracing hugs, but just by having that intimacy of the family environment and that model and that sort of nuclear family, so to speak, does that potentially cause this circulating increase?
Definitely. You actually see oxytocin right from the beginning. If you look to the beginning of procreation, a woman experiences a massive surge of oxytocin from the moment they're pregnant. Their body begins to prepare. Oxytocin plays a really key role in labor and their breastfeeding.
So you said pitocin, like to actually induce it.
Yeah, it does. It has a huge factor. But you actually see oxytocin rise within the male brain, who is the father, in that preparation period as well. The brain begins to know, I'm about to have to provide for this child. So right from the offset, oxytocin is rising within the two parents and then creating a rise in the baby once they begin to connect with it. As that family grows, oxytocin will naturally be experienced throughout the family. But when you say there, maybe they don't have time for a quick hug or whatever it might be, in my mind, the most truthful thing to say is that time needs to be made effectively. Like we need really connected, loving experiences. As a young kid, the parents need it between one another and they need it circulating around. And it's very important that this becomes a priority. And where people might not say they have time, and we have this all the time in our training, people don't have time. We also have an average among everyone we've trained of screen time being at 5 hours 47 a day. So people do have time. It's just where is that time being allocated? And if you took a simple scenario whereby a family was sitting in the evening watching TV, no one watches TV now without a phone in their hand. We have a 94% rate of people still have a phone in their hand whilst they watch TV. So pretty much no one watches TV just that isolated. And that's down the whole dopamine route of the fact TV's become boring now because we've screwed up our dopamine system. But if you took a situation where one family was sitting all in the lounge watching TV together and they all had phones in their hand, no oxytocin can transfer. It's way too distracting. Whereas if a family decided we're all going to watch a movie tonight, we're going to sit, maybe the mum and dad sit close to one another so there's some physical connection, or maybe you sit with your kid and you watch just the TV and you're all present and a good scene happens and you all were present when you saw it, and then you laugh together or you have some kind of engagement or conversation together. Those two scenarios are very similar. They're not a difference of how much time do we have. It's just a prioritization of presence effectively. And that second scenario is going to be far better for that family's oxytocin.
It's almost as though like it's emulating this effect that people would get by having, a text message relationship with someone. It's like that seems as though that is not truly getting you the oxytocin hit. That's purely a dopamine relationship where it's like, you see these things happen where like, unhealthy relationships over text message or even through pornography. It's like you've developed a relationship, but it's not the same as a true emotional connection. It's literally a high.
This is fascinating, this space, because when we were writing the book, I put tons of studies into this world of oxytocin, and social life was a key chapter of how do humans communicate, whether that's texting with your family, texting with someone you're dating, your kids, whoever it may be. And I came across this fascinating study that basically showed if you have two humans texting one another, whatever their relationship, if you have two humans texting one another, no oxytocin releases in the brain at all. As soon as those two same humans call one another and hear their voice, oxytocin immediately begins to increase within both of their brains. And it's very clear that the sound of a human voice is imperative to oxytocin rising. And that again comes back to that child-based scenario where you're a baby. If you could hear your primary caregiver's voice, it created a feeling of safety that someone was there to look after you. So oxytocin rose to create that feeling of love, of I am in presence and I'm safe with the people around me. When you look at how humans are communicating right now, if you look at like the dating scenario, for example, which is a big challenge for our world. A lot of people are single. I had a long period of being single. It's really hard to find a partner in our modern world. We go on a dating app and all it is images and text messages. There's no moments where you're like having immediate experiences of calling one another effectively. And it's very important that if you want to maintain a good relationship with a partner, or you want to maintain a good relationship with your kid, oxytocin needs to be increased through the sound of their voice. And it's something that I think we're underestimating because we're living in a very digital text-based world instead of a voice-based world.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, everything, relationships have just become like a dopaminergic, like transaction all the time.
Yeah, quick hits of pleasure. And that's what's happening in our world. We're in the pursuit of pleasure. We're not in the pursuit of like proper human connection. And that's not a path. Pleasure is not a path that leads us to happiness. It just leads us to like, oh, I feel really good right now. Now I feel really good. Whereas deep human connection is what creates that lasting feeling of happiness.
Are you familiar with the gap theory of happiness then?
No, I don't think I am.
This is right up your alley. The gap theory of happiness is essentially kind of comes from Stoicism in some ways, but where you're looking at, you're familiar with the hedonic treadmill, right? Like hedonic, like where the hedonic treadmill is essentially you're seeking more and more, more pleasure seeking upon more pleasure seeking upon more pleasure seeking, and the brain is always going to have this gap of your happiness lies between where you are now and what you next achieve, right? That's like the hedonic. And even if you achieve that next thing, then you need the fancier car and this is a scientific fact. This isn't woo-woo stuff. It is also woo-woo, but it's also scientific where you're just keeping up with the Joneses. And that's like a real thing. You're going to you get the big house, you need a bigger house. And it's not because you're a glutton. It's because that gap theory, happiness is supposed to be in that gap and in Stoicism, you're essentially, the trick is to how do you make yourself want what you already have versus want what you don't have. That's the kind of the idea of some of these practices. If you look at some of the famed Stoics out there, right? Seneca, for example. It's like you're looking at how do you want what you currently have, because it's that desire, that want, that usually makes you drive on that hedonic treadmill. So if you can stop and want the things you already have. So in Stoicism, it's kind of wild because they will literally even imagine a worst case scenario to allow themselves to want and desire what they already have. This is going to sound terrible, but things like imagining your loved ones getting in a terrible car accident and imagining for a second what it would be like to be without them, to bring you back to this present. It's kind of a mind trick to be like, I want what I already have, because that want, that gap, is where drive and happiness comes from. So looking for that wanting that drive with what you already have. So you're not on a hedonic treadmill, you're self-soothing with what you already have, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So the Stoics get a bad rap as being highly, highly negative, when in reality, they're embracing negativity to make themselves grateful so that they can be present. And the reason that I just mentioned that is because it's everything you're describing. Is like, we are just dopamine-driven, hedonic treadmill. How do we get the next? And it comes back even to our workouts, even into our, in the world that I'm in. It's like, okay, well, how do we get more ripped? Or how do we get more, build more muscle and this and that? And that's fine. Like, that's a good pursuit, but you'll never fully be satisfied. Like, are you going to be satisfied with more veins in your abs? Like, are you going to, be satisfied if you get laid more? Like, what are you really, really after? Like, all those things are fine and dandy, but like, if that's where your happiness lies, like, you're going to constantly be looking for more and more and more and more. And then it gets into a neurochemical discussion of like, where's your dopamine baseline and this and that.
Interesting. I think that then taps into gratitude. Gratitude is one of the main chapters of this oxytocin component of what we teach. And we are living so deeply in this comparison-based society where we constantly think about what we don't have or what we're not. We're not ripped enough, or our house isn't nice enough, or our car isn't amazing enough, or whatever it might be. And when you look into this, and this is all the training we've done with people to immerse themselves much more in this state of gratitude, it's very clear that comparison is thinking about what you don't have. Gratitude is simply reminding yourself of what you do. And interestingly, I wasn't actually aware of that theory, but exactly that is what we do, in terms of we get people to list out the things they might be grateful for, whether it's like, a lot of people feel grateful for access to nature, for example, or it might be family-based stuff, or opportunity you have in your life, or financial stuff. And we get them to go through the process of deeply visualizing not having that thing anymore, not having that person in your life. Or if someone has a real grateful feeling towards nature, imagining, okay, now you have 50 years, you can never see nature again, you can never be in nature again. And suddenly it makes them think, holy shit. And then they go through the process of, oh no, I do have the thing. And it creates this massive rise in gratitude. That rise corresponds with a massive rise in oxytocin. And you really want to imagine this is the feeling of love, this oxytocin chemical, and gratitude is the feeling of love for what you have, effectively. And it's such an important emotion to experience. Living in dissatisfaction for what we don't have is a horrible experience as a human being. Like, we think about it through the lane of our ancestors. There's lots of tribes that are still thriving today, like the Hadza in Central Africa. If I went to that tribe and with an iPad with a screen on it and showed them a video of an alternative tribe in South America, they might have, before they've seen that video, think, we're doing amazing, we got good connection, we got shelter, we got food. If I showed them a system that was an alternative version of what they have, that provided greater shelter and greater food and greater access to resources, they would suddenly enter dissatisfaction. And that was purely based on information that they had consumed. And effectively, we are living in that world, in the social media world, just constantly thinking, I don't have enough, and becoming incredibly ungrateful for what is. Teenagers experience this massively. Like, they have amazing lives, access to work and education and families and homes and everything, and yet they're living in such dissatisfaction. So this gratitude piece is so fundamental to oxytocin and ultimate happiness.
Dude, and it's like the worst in the fitness industry, because then you're just like, you open social media and you get a highly doctored photo of someone that, oh, they look better than me, then I need to, so it never ends, right? It never ends. And that's the thing, is that's not just like a colloquialism to say it never ends. Like, it literally will never end. It will cycle. It's called that hedonic treadmill for a reason. It's going to continue and continue and continue until you can find a place to find some gratitude. And I know this sounds like mushy stuff, but if you want the best outcome for you and your family, the true best outcome, you've got to be able to have that inner pull, and your workouts need, I'm putting this back into a fitness mindset, but your workouts need to be truly about like empowerment and not comparison to others. Like how do you get stronger so that you can be better, so that you can contribute more to society and more to the world, and this like deeper fundamental pull of why do you want to be 5% body fat? Why do you want, like, what's your real why in there, and that's difficult.
I think it does need to just be considered, how does the exercise, what is the knock-on benefit of the exercise? Of course, keeping physically fit, great benefit. And then you also have the fact exercise is incredible for the endorphin system, which de-stresses our brain. So if you're thinking about your exercise is going to make you calmer and a calmer person around your family, that's like an oxytocin lane of thinking around the exercise you're doing. Or if it is like more of a visual appearance type thing, which I totally understand, it's nice to be in good physical shape and to look good. It's like, what is the desired outcome there? Is it for someone to love me more? Like, is it for your partner to be more attracted to you, for example? And that's okay to want your partner to be attracted to you and have that as a driving factor. But if the only reason you're exercising is just in the pursuit of looking in the mirror and thinking, yes, I look great, and it's all about yourself, it's going to be a very unrewarding experience. Whereas if you're trying to correlate it with, this does create a better intimate relationship with my partner because she's more turned on when I connect with them, or it does make me better able to serve my family because I'm in better physical shape, or longer term, and I do like to think about this, I love the idea of having a family and then one day having grandkids and stuff like that. I find that a cool thing to ponder sometimes. I love the idea with physical fitness of being like a person that's 70, 80 years old that can hang from a pull-up bar and like walk with my like grandkids and pick them up and run with them and be really physically fit. And if the driving factor includes how am I going to be able to serve others, it's going to be a much more fulfilling pursuit. Whereas if it's only serve yourself, it's always going to be, I need more. I think
there's little ways that you can just dose that in there too, without having to become a soft, mushy mess, right?
For sure.
I mean,
it's just like slight conscious thought of how does it impact others around me, and it doesn't have to be mushy at all.
No, like I'm gonna do this lateral type movement because I want to be able to connect with my son and play football with him, or these little things like, here's a different purpose. One last question on oxytocin. Can we deplete it? For example, a common thing that men face, I know, is when especially when they have their wife has a new baby, and the mom is just having physical touch all day, and this is a really common thing. And by the time she's touched out, right? Like, don't touch me. I've had a baby crawling on me all day. The last thing I need right now is more physical touch. Yep. Is that just a depletion of oxytocin? How does that work, or is that a different thing altogether?
I think they would have been experiencing such an abundance of oxytocin. They also have the breastfeeding component taking place there, that it's effectively just like slightly burning out the resource. So they just don't have that yearning for, I need more right now. They think that is very satisfied. It's very fulfilled. I'm done with rising oxytocin. And in that area, I would then say,
bring out the whips and chains. I don't want this.
It'd be very important for the mom in that scenario to think about the pursuit of some of the other neurochemicals around, like, could I get some dopamine off something that feels rewarding for me personally in my own life, or serotonin through my nutrition or time in nature or sunlight, something that's different from oxytocin. Totally. In terms of can you deplete it, there are some things that you can see in research that are causing a lack of oxytocin's production. You can't hijack it in the same way we can with dopamine. But if you look down the lane of lack of social moments, which is really common in our digital kind of work from home lifestyle, if you look at distraction in social moments through the phone, that's a big factor. And then you have the other aspect, which is your oxytocin that you're creating with yourself. And it's really clear that criticizing your appearance in the mirror is a very significant impactor on oxytocin. And when we do this in the training, we look at people and they vote, what is my main cause of low oxytocin? Is it lack of social, or is it distraction, or is it critique of appearance? Everyone is critique of appearance, as you can imagine. And it's very important. Like, whilst, you can look in the mirror and be like, it would be cool if my shoulders were a bit bigger. And that's okay to say to yourself and drive yourself to work hard when you do your shoulder session. But it's very important to also acknowledge that your appearance is good, wherever it's at. It's like, even if you're still not in shape, you might be in better shape than you were, or whatever it might be. But constant critique of I'm not good enough is going to create very low levels of oxytocin in your brain.
Gotcha, man. Well, TJ, where can everyone find you, man?
If you go to @TJPower on Instagram, that's the best place. If you want to interact with Dose, you go on thedoselab.com. And I've just launched my new book, The Dose Effect, if you want to really optimize this stuff.
Right on, my man. Thanks, brother.
Let's go.